Michelle recently? Did you do Michelle recently?
Yeah. Wonder how that happened. Looks like more people showed up than they thought maybe chair. And coffee or water? Or not at all? Ready to roll? Indeed. Thanks for coming. Thank you everyone for coming. Wanted to welcome you all. It's our pleasure to have Dr. Joseph Gaughan here today. Dr. Gaughan is Associate Professor of Psychology in the clinical area and of American Culture and Native American Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He earned his undergraduate degree from Harvard College in 1992 and completed a doctorate in clinical community psychology at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And he did his internship at McLean Hospital, Harvard Medical School. And one of the things he's been doing over a number of years is grappling with treatment that works for American Indian people, and how researchers can respectfully acknowledge and work from frameworks of indigenous traditional knowledge, which has emerged from different historical non-Western frameworks than the kinds those of us in our scientific training have been presented with. So I'm really looking forward to this talk. I want to thank you for coming, and I want to ask if you could join me welcoming Dr. Gaughan. Joseph?
So I'm thinking that my voice can carry far enough for everyone to hear, but if you have trouble hearing in the back, please raise your hand, and then I'll know to try and up the volume, or if necessary, we'll get a microphone in here. First, thanks to Jim and to all of your amazing staff here for helping me get here. It was not fluid. It took a couple tries, but here I am. I'm really delighted to be here. I learned this morning that the University of Minnesota Medical School here has graduated 146 native MDs over the decades, and that's a legacy, of course, that you should arguably be very, very proud of, and I'm glad to know about it and learn about it and spend some time learning here today. Let's start with just a little bit about myself. I'm an academic psychologist, which is to say that I teach and do research at the University of Michigan. I am clinically trained as someone who could do psychotherapy, diagnosis, and so on. But I really am particularly interested in being community engaged with Native American people in their settings to try and figure out how to best help meet needs there. And of course, one is obliged to be culturally tuned in doing so. My research interests have to do with the intersection of culture and behavioral health in particular, with an emphasis on thinking about indigenous psychologies. That is, Western psychology is not the only way to think about psychological material, and indigenous peoples also have life ways that speak to psychological concepts and categories as well, and to think in particular about interventions in cross-cultural terms that might assist with remedying distress of various sorts. I have two sets of goals today in the time we have, which is not very long, a conceptual and a practical goal. In terms of the conceptual goal, I want to summarize the case for culture as treatment in American Indian Behavioral Health Services. And I also want to propose a shift away from our notions of cultural competence to an understanding of cultural commensurability in behavioral health programs. It's at a conceptual level, then I'll go on to the practical level of describing a very specific collaborative design, community-based alternative for treating American Indians with substance use problems. And I want to then extrapolate beyond that to grapple with the challenges facing this kind of project in our modern healthcare era. So let's start then with the case for American Indian culture as treatment, conceptual piece. We have what I call the post-colonial predicament for behavioral health services in American Indian communities. So post-colonial means after colonization, and as I'm sure you're all aware, American Indian people, indigenous people throughout the hemisphere have been heavily colonized throughout our histories by settlers who arrived primarily from Europe. And that has left in its wake devastation to many of our communities and lifeways. And so when I talk about a post-colonial predicament, I'm talking about a problematic or a dilemma that we as Native peoples face in the wake of that experience. So this predicament involves two pieces. On the one hand, we have very urgent community behavioral health needs. We live primarily in impoverished high-risk settings when it comes to reservation environments. And those settings have led to documented disparities in mental health status. This particularly involves high prevalence rates of trauma and its sequelae, of violence, of substance dependence, and so on. So we have urgent community needs on the one hand. But on the other hand, the clinical services that are on offer to help us deal with those kinds of issues are typically incongruent. So one of my very first research projects was on my home reservation, where I talked with middle-aged traditionalists who, when talking about IHS services for behavioral health problems, described white psychiatrists there as being involved in brainwashing people forever so they could be like white people. In other words, she was calling attention to the fact that conventional clinical services have a set of assumptions and commitments and ideologies associated with them. And he was particularly aware that those could involve transformations of Native people in ways that were the ongoing expression of colonization. Moreover, this idea of incongruent clinical service has been attested to throughout Indian country by anecdote. Lots of people in the human services will tell you that these services don't work for our people or for Native people in general, and also by some research evidence. So Melissa Walls is here. Melissa, you've done that study of service preferences among Western reservation residents, in which like the top 10 or something were all traditional sources rather than biomedical or psychological or mental health professionals. So, incongruent clinical services. Now, the professional remedy for this in psychology and in mental health and in medical care in general, I suppose, has come to be known as cultural competence. Cultural competence is largely refined by psychologists as a reaction to a so-called monocultural bias in the profession of psychology. Its goal was to counter the racist invalidations of clients that were happening when therapists who knew nothing about the people they were working with were imposing particularly expectations and assumptions on them without their really realizing what they were doing. And so its goal in some respects is to tailor clinical practice for the culturally diverse. How do I take the practices I engage in, like psychotherapy, and make sure that the treatment I'm offering can be truly helpful to people in their lives? Here is, probably the most refined version of cultural competence by Daryl Wayne Sue and colleagues. You see there are three columns here. You have a belief and attitude column, you have a knowledge column, and you have a skill column. And examples of these include in the belief attitude column, number 8, respects indigenous helping practices and community networks. This is an example of cultural competence in your attitudes. In knowledges, number 7, an example would be understands culture-bound, class-bound, and linguistic features of psychological health. In the skill column, number 7, can seek consultation with traditional healers. So you guys have these attributes then that are really important for a clinician or a therapist or counselor to have that makes them culturally competent to work with diverse constituencies. The focus here clearly is very much on therapist attributes, and the goal is to alter the intervention packages that are on offer through these services. So with that in mind, we want to, I think, spend a moment considering a deep rather than a superficial cultural divergence that happens in mental health services. So if the goal is to have a therapist who can package their activities in a way that can resonate with or call to Native or Indigenous clients, what we want to unpack further is the way in which the actual treatments that they use themselves have embedded assumptions, expectations, and norms above and beyond the superficial packaging through which they're offered. So there's a lot of detail here that we don't have time for today, but in terms of psychotherapy proper, Lawrence Permayer, a cultural psychiatrist, has documented the European and cultural origins of psychotherapy. As you can imagine, this comes from Freud originally out of Vienna, and has become a widespread set of practices that have wide reverberation in the modern world. Let me call your attention just to the bottom bit here. We talk about these others in the discussion if you like, but it should be obvious to you, I think, that whatever brand of psychotherapy you're familiar with, it relies primarily on psychologically minded, self-referential talk. First of all, it's a talking cure, so that's what sort of gives it a structure. Second of all, it involves psychological mindedness, which means the ability to look inward, to get in touch with the fact that you have, as a modern individual, very deep interiors that are very richly furnished, psychologically speaking, and you're supposed to introspect to learn about those things, to become aware of those things, and then you're supposed to talk about yourself with regard to those attributes or factors. Now, I've done work that tries to compare some of these assumptions of psychotherapy with American Indian therapeutic traditions or traditional healing practices, and there are some clear discrepancies that stand out right away, even if you look into this casually. Whereas psychotherapies are secular, native healing traditions are sacred. Whereas psychotherapies have to do with rational powers of humankind to problem solve the distress that people encounter, native traditions tend to rely on stuff that's much more mystical, has to do with things that are beyond human understanding in many aspects. And also, psychotherapy tends to be technical. In fact, increasingly today, you'll hear about psychotherapeutic techniques. You can get treatment manuals that are scripts that you follow to help you work with your client. And so the technique is really important. But in Indian traditional healing, by and large, these are not about techniques, they're about relationships. And the relationships are not just between the healer and patient, but also between the family members, and probably most importantly, between non-humans or other than human beings who are present and powerful in the actual treatment encounter. The point of all this is simply to point out that therapies are themselves cultural artifacts. That packaging of a therapy by a therapist in the name of cultural competence doesn't solve the problem of deep cultural discordance between the therapies themselves and people's psychological and cultural orientations as Indigenous clients. So this has led a student and I to try and come up with an alternative to cultural competence that would take stock of this deeper degree of cultural divergence. So this led us to want to shift focus, basically, away from culturally competent therapists, that is, trained practitioners who share assumptions, approaches, and aspirations, to culturally commensurate therapies, that is, established practices that are expressive of and constituted by expectations concerning restoration to health, well-being, and a good life. So part of what you have to recognize here is that any therapeutic practice is itself a cultural artifact that has embedded within it notions of what it means to be healthy, well, and to live a good life. And our interest in shifting away from culturally competent therapists is to take our eye off of the practitioner and his or her attributes and instead to focus on the practice itself that they use, whether it's psychotherapy or what have you, to look at the ways in which the practice of that therapy partakes of a whole world of cultural assumptions that are often very tacit and implicit for the very therapists who provide them. Thus, we posit a culture, a continuum of cultural commensurability. The continuum, of course, is aligned with two endpoints. And so on one end of the continuum, you have non-adaptive professional therapies. You could think of a manualized treatment for exposure therapy for PTSD, for example, which is the kind of stuff that crack scientists have come up with and that randomized controlled trials could attest to being efficacious. And you have a manual, a script. That would be an example of just on one end, of non-adaptive professional therapy. On the other end, you have local indigenous healing practices that are happening in communities every day. So you think about, I spent some time in Mondo, Lakota, where they have weekly ceremonies for, say, disabling grief and a host of other kinds of psychological but also physical health problems. So two endpoints, traditional healing and modern therapeutic practice. My point in arranging this continuum is to point out that neither of these, I think, is suited, ideally, for formal clinical services with Indians. On the one hand, non-adaptive, anything's not going to work with Native people. There at least has to be some attention to what might be going on for Native people, and for all people, for that matter. On the other hand, healing practices, they occur in communities, would have to go through a lot of adaptations in themselves to fit into clinical services properly. So neither of them in their pure form is suited for clinical service delivery, but what the continuum allows for is this vast creative middle space in which one can blend and mix and engage in creative hybridity to come up with ways to integrate both for purposes of service delivery for Native clients. Now, I just want to talk to you about some facets or attributes of this continuum. First of all, the goal of the continuum is really to promote conceptual insight. That is, if we have two ends, and I'm thinking about with my community partners, or the community partners themselves are thinking about, we want a kind of intervention that's more traditional than it is, biomedical. It's probably fixed closer to the end of the continuum where the traditional thing is. Someone else could say, well, yeah, but maybe that's not going to work so much for services. Let's shift it along the continuum, perhaps closer to the other end. So you can have that kind of insight and awareness even while you're blending or creating these kinds of hybrid interventions. It's not about normative judgment. This is not to say that the traditional is better than the professional. That would be up for community members to decide. It's not for outsiders to really determine that for them. And there are arguments pro and con on all sides that community members can attend to while they make that decision. So it's about promoting conceptual insight. There's no intrinsic value about where a therapy might be placed along this continuum, closer to the indigenous healing side, closer to the professional therapy side. Its appropriate placement is just a function of community vision and objectives. So depending on the constraints and the community partners that are in play, they may choose something on closer to one end rather than the other end. There's no intrinsic value. It's about what works in terms of community decision making. And the conceptual benefit of placement really lies in its implicit contrast with other alternative possibilities that you can map out in other places in the continuum. So if I'm thinking about something on this, closer to this end, again, we can think about what would it look like to do something closer to the other end, and what would be the pros and cons of tackling that kind of creative endeavor. It also facilitates broad critical attention to issues of cultural commensurability. That's the whole point in part, is to get away from who the therapist is and more about what is the practice they're engaging in. So what is it they're doing, and how is it that what they're doing is or is not more or less culturally commensurable with the setting and the people one's trying to work with. In this regard, it involves a heightening of consciousness. People are thinking and talking about cultural commensurability by virtue of trying to figure out how to create something along the continuum. And ultimately, it helps us to disentangle the neo-colonial from the post-colonial. This is super important. Neo-colonial means an ongoing colonization. Post-colonial, at least in some of the ways this term is used, means it is what a community chooses to do after colonization. So post-colonial is much preferable to neo-colonial. And actually the difference between whether a given approach, intervention, or project is neo-colonial or post-colonial probably only has to do in some instances with whether a community is choosing, community partners are choosing to do it or not. So if it's imposed from the outside, it could be neo-colonial. If it's grown from the inside, it could be post-colonial, even if it looks otherwise like exactly the same thing. So again, this is what the continuum is designed to help. So let's revisit this post-colonial predicament then in light of cultural commensurability. All of this is meant to help us recognize that clinical intervention is cultural prescription. There's no getting around the fact that if you're engaged in trying to help people, whatever it is you're doing that's trying to help them is culturally embedded, has a set of cultural sensibilities, cultural assumptions, and you are either aware of them or you're not, but there is a negotiation that happens with the people you're working with, depending on whether they share those assumptions or not. And therefore, in indigenous communities in particular, we need to acknowledge the danger of neo-colonial cultural proselytization for American Indians. Proselytization is a big word. What do you think of when you think proselytization? Think religion and missionaries, right? So one of my very earliest papers I questioned whether psychologists were not missionaries for a new millennium in indigenous communities. So the idea here is that if people charge off in Indian country with therapies that they think work and are unquestioningly supportive of their applicability to everybody, when they work with Native clients who occupy different sensibilities, they may well be engaged in somewhat like missionary work, indoctrinating people under the radar and without their knowledge or consent into forms of subjectivity or lived experience that are not of their own. All this leads me to want then to consider indigenous claims. And wherever you go in Indian country today, you'll hear Indian people say, so if you're familiar with human services, psychology, mental health, and so on, our culture is our treatment. So what do they mean when they say our culture is our treatment? Usually, first of all, they're saying we don't need evidence-based practice pushed from the outside by the government or by X body, or psychologists or medical professionals. Our culture is our treatment. It means that something inside or interior to our own community has the secret for helping us to recover from the ravages of colonization as they're expressed through various forms of distress and mental suffering. Our culture as our treatment is comprised of these sort of components here. One is that therapeutic alternatives really are based on reclaimed traditional practices. So instead of looking to the best the West has to offer in this particular moment, it's instead looking back to our own traditions and trying to identify the therapeutic practices and orientations that gave rise to traditional healing and figuring out how to reclaim those in purposes toward recovery. Second, it involves a holistic rationale, typically holistic, grounded primarily in spiritual and religious experience. So again, I told you before, one of the big differentiators was sacred and secular. Almost inevitably, the communities are interested in this our culture is our treatment claim. The treatment they have in mind is overtly spiritual and religious in some fashion. Finally, it's more holistic in how it targets therapeutic change. So it is addressed to personal distress, an individual who's suffering, and hoping, of course, to help them to get well. But beyond just getting well, it's also addressed to broader shared issues of cultural identity. How is it that I can be an Indian person in the modern world? How can I find a meaningful place for myself and envision a future for my family or my children that has continuity of the past but is adapted to the modern? So cultural identity, which is a shared component, is often invoked when it comes to mental health problems in indigenous communities and is an important target of change when it comes to our culture is our treatment kinds of claims. Finally, it's also oriented toward community renewal and self-determination. So there's a link here that suggests that if you can address in our culture of our treatment the reclamation of traditional practices involving spiritual and religious experience, not only do we address personal distress and cultural identity, but the whole community benefits in collective fashion through renewal and the ability to be more self-determining because people are more functional and have a more a robust shared sense of purpose with each other. So, in terms then of pursuing a post-colonial remedy, I want us to think about an alternative here. There's a usual approach for how one goes about culturally adapting psychosocial interventions for mental health problems. And it's usually to start with mainstream psychosocial interventions of some kind, often evidence-based treatments or evidence-based practices, maybe a manualized therapy, and then adapt these for use in diverse community-based mental health services. So like in medicine, we'll hear, put some feathers on the cover, use some indigenous language throughout, and somehow this typical approach is now adapted for Indian use. which again gets at the superficial rather than the deep. I want them to think about an inverted approach to how one can make therapeutic approaches that would be more deeply culturally resonant. And so in this regard, I wanted to start with local therapeutic traditions. That is, start locally with the traditional healing practices that have been provided historically and what they look like today, and then cultivate these secondarily for use as interventions in community-based mental health services. So rather than take a stock established therapy and dress it up in beads and feathers, I was interested in looking back at traditional approaches to healing or therapeutic and then figuring out how to make that work within the context of service. All this entails then a creation of imaginative, local, indigenous interventions that draw on relevant aspects of often revitalized traditional healing practices. And there are lots of precedents in Indian country for doing this kind of blending, integration, and so on. The study I can't tell you about today that I did in Manitoba that documented one substance abuse treatment program's efforts to blend the Western with the traditional. And you can find this everywhere you go in Indian country, in substance use treatment in particular, the blending of the Western with the traditional. 12-step stuff is very popular because it has an overt spirituality to it, but also traditional things like the sweat lodge. Even 30 years ago, when people first started writing about traditional treatment, the sweat lodge was pretty prominent, and now it's virtually everywhere in substance use treatment. So clear precedent. But one thing that's different is that these typically were either integrative, that is, pulling Western and indigenous kind of on equal footing. Often they were not fully integrated, they were just components sandwiched together. Or the Western really tended to dominate in terms of where the therapeutic action was assumed to be. Or they were adapted, taking an established thing and making it Indian, so to speak, as opposed to truly indigenous, which is kind of growing from the local ground up in cultural terms. I in particular was interested in the indigenous alternative. So, let's talk a bit then about an indigenous alternative. Back in 2008, I guess, I approached the director of the Blackfeet Substance Abuse Treatment Program, known as the Crystal Creek Lodge on the Blackfeet Reservation. I met him at a meeting, and I was really impressed by him and struck with his interest perhaps in doing something different. And so I went to visit their staff and talked with them about the difference between adapting versus indigenizing. And they got very excited about the indigenous alternative, and so we've had a partnership since then to try to get stuff off the ground. The Crystal Creek Lodge is a residential substance abuse treatment center. It also has outpatient and referral services too. But it has 20 beds, and patients will come live for 60, 90, 120 days at a time. It's the only accredited tribally administered substance abuse residential program in Montana. Follows a Minnesota model program primarily, which has to do with kind of a milieu for clients to live. It's mainly group-based in terms of going to a lot of activities as groups that are structured throughout the day. It's based on Alcoholics Anonymous. In particular, this program is situated on the first 5 steps of the 12 steps. I have all Native staff, mostly Blackfeet, but not exclusively, but all Native staff. And all of the clients, of course, are Native and stuff. And most of the clients are Blackfeet themselves. Again, I approached them, as I said, gauged their enthusiasm, and they were particularly interested in looking at Blackfeet's spirituality. And so we began an extended consultation in August of 2009, and the culture counselor at the program, along with the director, put me in touch with and kind of guided our collaboration with Blackfeet Bundle Keepers. In other words, there's a grassroots cultural society there called the Crazy Dog Society. Crazy Dog Society is interested in revitalizing the, quote, old Blackfeet religion. They really draw a sharp contrast between the old Blackfeet religion and Pan-Indian stuff. For example, their Sundance isn't really a Sundance, it's the Okan. It's different than plain Sundances in other respects. And they're built around, their religion is built around bundle ceremonies throughout the year. So there are bundle keepers that have ceremony implements that they open up and use ritually at regular times throughout the year. Our goal was to formulate a radically alternative kind of treatment in quotes, because who knew what it was going to look like? It was kind of up to them to come up with what they thought would work here. And what they came up with was a summer cultural immersion camp. In some ways, I think of the old AIM survival camps from the 1970s is probably one of the precedents for this, perhaps. But the idea was that they could bring treatment clients out to a camp out where they live in teepees, and in some ways try to live like their ancestors, were more like their ancestors used to live, living off the land, learning traditional stuff, and most importantly, practicing traditional spirituality along the lines of the old Blackfeet religion, at least getting initiated to it, if nothing else. It was guided by members of the Crazy Dog Society, so these are ritual people. They are not trained as substance abuse treatment providers. They're not therapists in any kind of respect. They're just members of this grassroots society who are experts in religious practice. And so they were going to be, in many respects, guiding what this could look like. The goal was to socialize clients, again, into the old Blackfeet religion. And it was implicitly understood, or tacitly understood, that healing and recovery from this program comes really from the spiritual practices. And throughout Indian country, spiritual practices are understood to recirculate, to move life, if you will. In a New Age moment, we used to say energies today, but energies are personal and life is not. So there's something about life that needs to be unpacked that I won't do today, but life can circulate in ways that literally leads to longevity in your lifespan, but also brings prosperity and wellness and so on. And the ceremony is what's responsible for circulating this, which is why the return to the old Blackfeet religion is understood to be absolutely imperative for members of the Crazy Dog Society and other adherents within the Blackfeet community. So we decided to implement this in the summer of 2012. We had trouble getting grant funding for it, by the way, so this is why this project drew on for quite a while. But Colloquium, who's the director there, was able to find some money. Went through the IRB where they determined it was not regulated because it was basically program evaluation, quality improvement stuff. Piloted it in 2012. When we set all this out, I had no idea if this was even possible. Like, could this really work? How would a client feel out there? Who's going to run it? Can they run it in a way that clients will take to? Because clients aren't in a very good place in many respects, or they would be clients in a residential substance abuse treatment. So it's really proof of concept just to see, can this thing run for a period of time? Can there be activities that structure people's life? How will clients receive it and so on? Obviously sponsored by the lodge, staffed by the Crazy Dog Society members. There were actual counselors on site as sort of liaison and to, manage any risk that could come, liability issues and so on, because they are treatment clients. By and large, they were just participants at the same level as the clients in many respects. And to start with, there were only 4 male clients who were wanting to come out for this thing. This is true throughout Indian country when there's something new, especially if it has spiritual, religious, or traditional components to it. People are a little reluctant until they hear more about it, see what it is. Women in particular were not interested in participating, at least in this first round. So that raises some interesting questions about why that might be the case. We ended up then with 4 clients for this proof of concept, and it was a 2-week set of activities. So what happened? Really, you can divide these activities up into traditional skills, cultural practices, and ritual participation. It was 2 weeks of people living out of the camp, getting up in the morning, having a chance to go back into the treatment center for a shower or whatever on days that they felt like they needed it. And then activities would start after breakfast, and they would go all the way till bedtime at night, essentially. There were cooks hired to come cook, so that wasn't something they had to worry about so much. Really, the Crazy Dogs had a schedule of activities that they could draw from, and sometimes it was required to change the plan a little bit in the last minute because maybe it's raining, it's not a good day to do this, and you have something else to happen. Traditional skills included setting up teepees. In fact, the whole first day was setting up the teepees. They wanted to put up a double lodge for a kind of group meeting area, and so that was kind of complex. It was an adventure the whole day, actually. There were lodge painting, berry picking, plant harvesting, hide tanning, and collecting a niskim. And I'll just tell you a little story about the niskim. A niskim are fossilized animals, like bachylites or ammonites is what paleontologists would refer to them, which are little shellfish from way back when. You can find these fossilized niskim at various points from the Blackfeet Reservation. And the Blackfeet have a long tradition of finding particular niskim or thunderstones or buffalo stones, I think they call them. They wrap them up in a little bundle and they can wear them, and they bring God, they can pray to them, and so on. Well, we had a particular client who had been in treatment because he had a court case pending, and he was worried that he was going to go to jail or prison because but she was charged with assaulting a police officer on the reservation. And he heard that his court case was coming up. He had to go to court in the middle of the camp, and his anxiety was really off the charts at that time. And this was about the time we went to collect the niskim, so he thought of this niskim, he bundled it up, he painted it the way they do, and he thought all kinds of guidance about how to pray to it. And was praying to it a lot right before going to the hearing. He showed up at the hearing the cop never showed up or something, the charges were dropped, and he didn't have to face prison anymore. And he talked about that for the rest of the camp, about how important this had been to him as a source of solace, and he believed efficacy around trying to make sure that he didn't end up in a bad situation. So some of these practices can be extremely meaningful to people, as you might imagine. Cultural practices include storytelling, family ancestry, sacred sites, decision making. We went up to Chief Mountain, which is the holiest space in the Blackfeet cosmology. There near the reservation, and had a pipe ceremony up there. It was amazing. And ritual participation, whether it was talking circles, pipe ceremonies, the sweat lodge, and transfer rate, one of the Crazy Dog Society practices. This was obviously the foundation and the bedrock. The first thing we did after setting up the teepees was to have a pipe ceremony, and then the next day was all sweat lodge, where we just went out in the bush and built a sweat lodge from whatever was out there. And, pretty remarkable in terms of what people were able to experience. So that the spiritual stuff, as I've said repeatedly, was really, really central to what's going on. I think another piece to it that went to help everyone feel good about this were several aspects of the camp ethos. First of all, it was very leisurely paced. I mean, there was no, rigid schedules. At 10 o'clock you got to do this, 11 o'clock you do this. The way it is in the treatment center, actually, where your groups start and you have to be up at a certain hour. So the fact that it was, when people were ready, things started. It was Indian time, so to speak, and that resonated a lot with people. It was very loosely scripted, so it could be flexible. If you didn't do this today, you could do that tomorrow. If tomorrow rained out, you did something else. We do this the next week. For example, one of the goals was to teach them how to hunt buffalo in a traditional way, so they were trying to get permission from the council to kill buffalo. And in the end, it wasn't allowed, so they had to do a backup. So this kind of loosely scripted stuff mattered a lot. It was really sensitively guided, and I think this is super crucial. My colleague at Michigan, Scott Lyons, who's a Leachlaker and professor of English and Legal Studies, writes about culture cops. In all of our communities, we have people who are like the cultural experts and who are hardliners about it. Like, it's my way or the highway, that's not how we did it traditionally. And so, this kind of thing won't work very well if you have a culture cop running it because they're too rigid. And in this regard, I think the people who had, Rick Brown in particular, who's a leader in the Crazy Dog Society, just had a really easygoing, very supportive, very gentle demeanor where there were no hard lines, there were no rigid, mostly humor if people didn't made mistakes or absolutely whatever. He was just fantastic, and I think this counted an awful lot for the clients finding real solace from this. It was, of course, staff monitored, as I said, because in our treatment clients, they're in some cases responsible, the treatment center is responsible for ensuring their welfare. And, of course, community engaged because of the Crazy Dog. So the Crazy Dog is a society that has, depending on what meeting you go to, who comes and who's there that day, and the phone keepers, blah, blah, blah. But, we had sometimes 20 people come to this thing in the day to do stuff with the activities. One day it'd be 20, the next day it'd be 6. And, some people would reappear, other people you'd only see once. So it was very porous boundaries in terms of who was there and what they were doing. But everyone understood they were part of the Crazy Dogs, and therefore they were authorized to be there. What it meant is a lot of people on site didn't know who the clients were and who they weren't, and didn't care. So in many respects, it broke down this boundary between, staff and clients, and community members and clients. Which of course does a lot to eradicate some of the stigma and the shame people might feel for being in substance abuse treatment, where any place where substance use is highly moralized, as it is in many communities and in mainstream society. So what are some enduring impressions? It was really memorable and inspiring, first of all. I mean, the sacred and socio-political significance of this endeavor was really quite incredible, and it'd be hard to underestimate the meaning it had, I think, for the staff and for the Crazy Dogs and for those community members who were involved with us, thinking about alternatives to the usual kind of thing, which people worry don't work very well. Interestingly, it was, I would say, completely unrecognizable as a form of psychosocial treatment. There was no counseling, there was no skills-based practice or participation. There was nothing that looks like, there was no 12 steps talk, really. I mean, it wasn't psychoeducational. I mean, it was basically, being exposed to, learning, and participating in the activities of your ancestors, as those are made meaningful today. And so, in that regard, it was really alternative, which is in part what we had on the table when we were trying to design this. Obviously, it centered traditional spirituality and religious experience in important ways. and promoted a really genuine sense of community and belonging. And that sense was very deliberate because part of the goal of developing something local like this was to put people into networks of sobriety that aren't called networks of sobriety and aren't based on commitments to sobriety, except ancillary to ceremonial participation when you can't drink. You're not supposed to drink if you're going to be involved in those ways. So in some respects, the goal was to involve people in these networks that could continue on as a member of the Crazy Dogs, say, if one wanted, and were willing to pledge and be initiated after treatment. And it was really valued by the clients, it turned out. Again, only 4, but one somber client, age 31, reported that he participated in substance abuse treatment on 10 prior occasions, noted that, quote, the difference here is they focus more on the positive aspects of life, where Alcoholics Anonymous tries to drill it into you that you're powerless. Don't have that powerlessness. You have sacred residences in a setting like this that Alcoholics Anonymous doesn't probably mean. He estimated his odds of achieving sobriety following the camp at 60-40, a non-trivial improvement from his estimate of 50-50 odds in response to conventional treatment, which might have been generous because he'd been treated 10 times before. His overall assessment of the intervention was at about 58%. I like it. So he was very precise in his quantitative. The remaining clients were more enthusiastic. The second client, age 31, who was in treatment for his first time, had been exposed to traditional Native practices in several different communities over the years. With regard to the camp, he emphasized the benefit of learning Blackfeet traditions specifically, and declared that, quote, it's been really wonderful, actually. I didn't think treatment could be like this. A third client, age 20, who had participated in treatment twice before, and was court-ordered treatment this time, choosing the camp option, explained that, quote, I'd actually prefer this one over the other kind of treatment. It's more open, free. We don't follow a strict schedule and strict rules that put you in that mentality of being a child. His overall assessment was that, quote, it's excellent. That's all I can say. Final client, age 54, who had participated in treatment on 3 prior occasions, was court-ordered as treatment this time again, choosing culture camp, declared that, quote, once I got into it, it's like something changed in my life. His summary impression was that, quote, I thank the Great Spirit I did come out here and participate in the Word. I'm glad I came here. In sum, all 4 clients expressed appreciation for the camp as a novel and distinctive approach to treatment for substance abuse that have touched their lives in meaningful ways. Now, that's not to say there aren't concerns and considerations and things to want to be critical about. So I think there are things we're trying to explore in the wake of this. First of all, it's a mere proof of concept, right? 4 clients, what's that, right? So this thing would have to grow. They did operate again in the summer after I was not able to be there. They got more clients, they got women clients, they changed the structure of it. So we're probably going to do it again this summer, and I'll have a chance to be on it. Maybe do an update at some point. Obviously, there might be gender analysis, especially that first time. Why was it for women? We're not interested in doing it. This might have to deal with the traditional roles of Plains Indian women and Blackfeet women specifically, or it might have to do with some modern inflection of those. Or it might have to do simply with they didn't want to have to camp out there. So one thing they did this last time was let women go back, or anyone can go back into the treatment center overnight if they wanted. And that's one of those structural things we think might make a difference. But I think there are gender issues beyond that are in my analysis. Of course, the big one is there's really undetermined outcomes relative to client substance abuse. It's one thing to love the program you're in. It's another thing to stop abusing substances. In that regard, we have to remember that substance abuse is increasingly framed as a chronic recurring problem, and no state of treatment would be expected or assumed to necessarily cure people of substance abuse. The rates of falling back into substance abuse after treatment, even in the mainstream, are really high. So it's really common, in fact it's the norm, to go back to substance abuse as opposed to achieve sobriety through, especially one course of treatment. So we've got to make sure it's a fair measure here, but these are the questions that still have to be addressed. And one question I want to just focus on for a second has to do with whether, in fact, the particular structure and goals and vision of this alternative actually confounds formal evaluation procedures. The culture of treatment claim, of course, is a hypothesis for cultures of treatment, and there's a rationale for it. It's not that it's crazy. So, we could talk about historical trauma as a kind of local folk discourse, which is a way of talking about the fact that the epidemic of social problems we have on many reservations came in the wake of colonization that has to do with the attack on our way of life. And so that reclaiming, revitalizing that way of life, finding continuity, it becomes one important way to try and overcome those particular kinds of problems. Many Indian people will attribute their recovery to substance abuse, even like chronic Skid Row substance abuse, to cultural participation. So we know from a large literature that that's very common, and that's certainly true with people I work with, even in the crazy dogs. We have a scientific literature that links traditional cultural practices to Indian recovery. It's usually cross-sectional, but not always, and it's growing. But it seems to suggest the idea that people who are sober tend to be more involved in cultural practices. And of course, just a common sense, familiar notion of acknowledging that things essential spiritual reorientation can in fact yield dramatic transformations in people, in their purpose and their motivation, in their spiritual and social network. Just think of people I know, back in the day who've gone through radical Christian conversion, for example, and whose lives were completely changed around from something that wasn't working to something that worked. But there are crucial empirical questions for ongoing research. Can processes linking culture and recovery in these communities be harnessed and deployed as treatment? It's one thing to have found a way yourself naturalistically, or to post hoc and retrospective fashion attribute the recovery to culture, but can you actually harness it prospectively and make a difference? Is cultural immersion enough to truly remedy substance abuse across a range of addiction severity? If you've been in treatment 10 times, you might ask, what is there to lose from trying something new? You also might ask, what is there to gain from something like this? Maybe what they need is evidence-based technique that they aren't getting really either in India. Can scientific evaluation of cultural treatment projects overcome small sample sizes, constraints on random assignment, and so on? In other words, if one felt like you needed to do a randomized controlled trial to obtain evidence about efficacy here, the odds are pretty long that one could do that. In part because this was an indigenously grown or localized treatment, and if you were going to do the process with another community, it might look quite different what they would want. And can development, implementation, and evaluation of these kinds of projects successfully compete for research funding? So far, my answer is no. Finally, I think the biggest challenge that I want to leave you with today is, what if there are irreducible trade-offs between creation of community-driven post-colonial interventions and the design of portable, replicable, and scientifically valuable interventions? What if those two things are not able to be brought together in the case of something like the culture? A few take-home points. Clinical behavioral health services are vexed for American Indians by post-colonial predicament. Professional and Indian therapy traditions diverge in substantial ways. But because these therapies are themselves cultural artifacts, we may need to move beyond cultural competence as a way of addressing that divergence. A compelling point of departure for looking into cultural transferability is this indigenous claim that our culture is our treatment. Culture as treatment projects can depart substantially from recognizable forms of psychosocial intervention, as it might not look like therapy at all. And scientific evaluation of these kinds of projects might be actually quite difficult and remain offline. I've written more about this kind of stuff and other things, so if you're interested, you can check out my website. And I'm glad now to see that we still have these 10 minutes left for some discussion and conversation, so I'm looking forward to your reactions. Thank you.
We have 15 minutes for questions, so please.
I guess my first question is, in terms of evidence-based practice and evidence-based treatment, and you pointed out that there is a scientific literature pointing to the fact that culture is treatment across a lot of tribes, across a lot of nations. But as a provider, when we're sitting down here and we have to justify a treatment to some type of regulating body, what stands in the way of us getting this culture as treatment box into things like formularies or treatment schedules, so that instead of cognitive behavioral therapy or some mindfulness-based intervention, stuff like that, we can click the same box that says and get it funded, get the equal amount as money as sending them to someone down the hall, maybe a traditional healer or something like that. Like, there's a disparity there, a disconnect that I've certainly found, working in a number of different systems in Native communities.
So I think that there are two ways to think about that problem. First one is as a scientific problem. So I don't think that there is evidence for culture as treatment that is of the most robust kind that would persuade skeptics, say, through randomized controlled trials. So that evidence does not exist. The kind of evidence we do have is often cross-sectional and correlational. And as you know, correlation does not cause. And so we don't have the strongest causal evidence that could register some approaches like these onto these registries or lists of evidence-based treatments. And so one way to think about this problem at the scientific level is to try to get such evidence so that they can be called evidence-based. You think of Teresa LaFramboise's suicide prevention program, which is listed by SAMHSA and NREP as evidence-based, but it's prevention, not treatment. And it's more skills-based, it's not indigenous from the ground up. So that would be one thing, which is the scientific. The other is to skip over all that because tribes have sovereign nation-to-nation relationships and just go political and just force the powers that be, I guess you can't force them, pressure them to change the requirements so that in Indian circles or settings, those lists and those reimbursement policies are not in effect in the same way. I think that's been the process that many tribal constituencies have gone for, and it's worked in some way. They pushed back against SAMHSA some years ago, and SAMHSA relented. So it's possible to make some progress in that regard. Those are two avenues I think that are available. At some level, though, what we're talking about here is not what a practitioner will ever be able to do. Practitioners do what they're trained to do, and they do what they do within their settings, and they're paid to do them in that way. And so you start, if you need more than 50 minutes for your session, and you're going to, anyway, a lot of problems emerge if you're going to stay in a practitioner role. So I'm really not addressing practitioners per se, because I don't think there's that much room for creative flexibility in that role.
I want to push you a little bit on your dichotomizing. You described two poles, neither of which were appropriate for formal clinical services. You talked the Ulithi ceremony. You talked on the other end about manual-based exposure therapy. And then you went on, and I'm thinking of you described the possibility, the creative possibilities of hybridization. You go on, you're thinking of science broadly, not with capital S, but broadly. Isn't there a possibility for a similar kind of hybridization between indigenous traditional knowledge and scientific approaches that you alluded to earlier, which actually may be possible in this realm? Clearly, power and who's the power to make decisions is a crucial part of the analysis. I wonder if you could riff on that idea, what that might be, or.
I have a whole presentation about indigenous traditional knowledge, so trying to figure out what to say most helpful here. Just let me think for a second. First of all, I think that the way in which indigenous traditional knowledge and science come together is not obvious. At some level, sometimes I think they're completely separate, hermetically differentiated spheres of influence. Then, of course, I recognize that they do come together in many respects, and the way they come together is not strictly systematic. I think it just falls together or is patched together in various ways. One way that I think this often works is that the indigenous traditional knowledge, whatever we call that, is the opinions of community members about what to do, and then science comes to tell us whether it works. So that's a common way that these things come together, which I don't know, I would not frame community perspectives on what to do as necessarily indigenous traditional knowledge. It might be. I think part of the dilemma of talking about this stuff is that it's just very deep and the concepts themselves are hard to label. What's the difference, say, between indigenous knowledge claim and indigenous knowledge system? What's the difference between an Indian who practices science and an Indian who doesn't, in terms of the claims they make, for example? Anyway, so that's a whole conversation that I'd love to talk about sometime. It's hard for me to know what to say now. I know that's probably a comment. Sorry.
Thank you.
Hi. So I had a general question individuals were there, and it was more spiritual and cultural.
Yeah.
But was there anything involved with talking circles and how they ended up in their situation, just to sort of open up the bigger discussion to have them look at how they got into that position and maybe tying up what they learned in the past 2 weeks on moving forward to work with relapses, or maybe if they leave the facility, how they're going to carry on that to their other lives.
So I think what you described is a way in which those steeped in therapeutic sensibilities would recommend that such a thing end. That's not how it ended. In part, it ended with a ceremony, as you can imagine, and a ceremony in which people weren't introspecting and reflecting and catching. So I think that one thing this points to is a pretty stark differentiation between therapeutic sensibilities, which those of us in biomedicine and clinical health and so on are steeped in and think is normal and desirable, and traditional religious kinds of systems that maybe are not at all interested in some of those introspective and self-examining sorts of therapeutic kinds of talk and so on. But I take what you're saying as the kind of thing that I bet would exist in many forms of the hybridization that people might come up with. And I have seen that in other settings, like the little setting I referenced. Here, yes.
So what were the, aspects you added in that were more clinical psychology?
I didn't add anything. It wasn't mine. It really wasn't mine. It was theirs.
Yeah.
It's what they came up with, and it didn't look like clinical psychology at all.
Yeah.
But they believed that it was therapeutic
For
substances.
Is it really a hybridization then?
Well, in this instance, it was in the sense that it was the indigenous form of the hybridization, I suppose, in which you start locally and figure out how to accommodate the services. So in that sense, these were treatment clients who had to be monitored by treatment staff who were coming out under the guise of treatment to participate in something that was funded by the treatment program. And all of those have things that are get to be hybrid-like, but obviously it was on the indigenous end, or the traditional end of that spectrum, which is the kind of thing that I've always been kind of interested in treating.
Yeah, class, they're not ditching you, lifting you.
Well, take a distance. Yes.
So I'm interested in the reconcilability between the kind of top-down, scientifically driven, evidence-based treatments and then the bottom-up, ground-up practices. And I tend to think they're sort of irreconcilable. But I just want to get your take on the generalizability problem. And, because then the question is sort of, it's evolved into a whole bunch of local practices, and what do we generalize, and people freak out about that.
That's right.
So I'm just wondering how you think about that and address that.
So Jim here from community psychology that wants the interest in thinking about generalizability of interventions, not so much on form, that is the structure of a particular set of practices or techniques, but on function. So what generalizes may be the function of a post-colonial process by which a community comes up with a local something addressed to their own needs. And so what generalizes is that process that comes up with something. That cultural content could be really different, the structure could be different, but what's the same is that it partakes of community sensibilities to want to revitalize, reclaim, and harness traditional therapeutic stuff for their own purpose. And that's the best I can do in a short minute. Anything else? One more? Someone say something like provocative.
What?
Well, there it is.
Well, I want to ask you to thank Joseph for coming. I want to highlight, he tried to come here twice. He got turned back the first time, and he came back again and had to take a bus the last bit of the way here. So we really appreciate, and if you ever come back again, we'll make sure the plane gets through in one shot, okay?
Thank you very much.
Where are you from?
I'm at the University of Michigan. I'm Grove from Montana.
I was thinking, I just started reading them.
After you read it, let me know. I'll put it. Well, everyone agrees some of those things are problems. We don't go back and not having more. It's always
I'm just kidding around. The overnight, and then 2 hours. You can
And I'll be in my office all afternoon. If there's any snafu or anything goes wrong, or you don't want to go next, you can look me up.
Joe, I assume you get lunch plans now? Okay. We were just talking food here. I want to make sure. I'm sure you have. Every waking hour? There you go, Melissa. Please read that.
Hi, I'm Garrett.
You got enough copies for the master's program at work? Guess what? These are Amanda, Seth, and then all work in the on the projects that I have going. So,
Very interesting. You're doing a lot of work in Duluth Medical.
How are you? Yeah. I want everybody to touch it just for good luck. Just to make this rubber.
you guys.
What is supplemental medicine in there?
Well, I wanted to meet around the back. Yeah, what she said, so with her CRC, she said like 8 tribes or something like that.
Yeah, 8.
So she said on the 28th, and she's going to be hanging out, not proposing anything. So I mean, I think the earliest we probably put in a proposal would be like start thinking about writing something up in the summer. It's the earliest. Interviews and stuff like that. Because I mean, I was also thinking about, I just talked to her, and what I wanted